All right, folks, Paul Cappiello here in the backyard garden for another installment of What's Going On Out There. It's Friday afternoon, and it's about time for me to get planting annuals, but before I get to all the planting of the containers, thought I'd take a spin around the yard and see what's looking good, what's in bloom, and what hasn't really made the cut. You'll see a lot of empty containers sitting around because that's sort of the next plan, but a few cool plants. First of all, we'll start with this little beauty here. This is one of the Japanese forest grass, Hakanakloa macra. This is a cultivar named All Gold. And this is our absolute favorite. There's Aureola, which is the yellow and green striped one. There's a white striped one that's not very vigorous, but this thing, in part shade or full sun, it just makes the most spectacular texture and is absolutely tough to beat. You can see hanging over it, just finishing up, are the native columbines, Aquilegia canadensis, up against this little trellis. And then my favorite clematis of all time, Clematis ragucci, just starting to bloom. It grows up the trellis maybe 4 or 5 feet. When it finishes blooming later in the spring, I'll cut it back and it'll come back for another little round of blooming. They make pretty good cuts and that they last a long time, but they're kind of hard to, the way they hang down like that, they don't work great in vases, but I've always got a couple of them cut, and the thing just blooms and blooms and blooms, and it's just a really outstanding little plant. Next to that, of all the heucheras we grow, this is the one with the staying power. This is one by the name of Green Spice. I've had it in the ground here in my garden. Got to be at least a dozen years. You can see it's already put out its flowers. They're just about finished. They're not really much. You just grow this for the foliage, but fantastic red-veined green leaves, a little bit of silver background. We have grown another one at Udell called Dale's Strain. It doesn't have quite as much red in it, but it's also a good one. But this, I think of all the scores and scores of heucheras I've grown, this one is hands down the one that lasts the longest. It's durable, the foliage looks great all summer, and it can take about half sun, or it can take some pretty good shade and still look really quite good. So there you go, that's Green Spice heuchera, still one of my favorites, and sometimes a little hard to find. Now we'll wander over into the little more shade here. Some really fun stuff. Always gonna love the perennial begonia grandis. This is one of those that just sort of runs around the garden. It pops up here and there. It's very easy to edit. Great textured, big bold leaves with red veins. And then about midsummer, it'll burst open, bright pink flowers, and they'll bloom through a lot of the summer. It's good for dry shade. It'll grow just about anywhere. It doesn't like hot sun, but other than that, it's really outstanding. And then next to it, sort of peeking out here, let's pull off a few holly leaves. This is a fairly new one. We've been growing quite a few of these at Udell. This is called the shredded umbrella plant. Great texture plant, perfect name for it. It's actually a member of the aster family, and it'll make a flower spike about 2.5 feet tall or so with a little white bloom. But you definitely grow this just for the texture. You can see up against the hostas, it's kind of a fun little bit of texture. And then one of my all-time favorite shade plants. This is one of the so-called evergreen Solomon seals. This is Disperopsis pernii. We've been growing tons of these in the nursery at Udell. People don't really know much about it yet, so they haven't started buying little tiny flowers. You don't really grow it for the flowers. It's this nice glossy foliage. It'll take dark shade. It's not a rambunctious spreader. It'll spread slowly to make a nice little pocket ground cover, and it'll stay evergreen down to about 10 degrees. So it doesn't make it through the whole winter, but it makes it into a good part of the early part of the winter, still looking nice and green. And I love this plant. You're gonna see a lot more of these on the grounds at Udell. And then a little more texture, gotta have some ferns. This is Lady in Red lady fern, Ethereum felix femina. And the red is just in that center stipe, the center stalk of the fern. Bright sort of blood red color and real fine texture. I've got these, you can see I've got them poked all over the garden, and they're just great for texture. So you add some shredded umbrellas, the bold hostas, and the perennial begonias, and then the fine textured fern. That's really a nice combination. Oak leaf hydrangeas we'll get to in another week or so when they start doing a little bit more. That's Sykes dwarf. But one I wanted to bring you over here and show you is just such a great plant. This is actually a native in this part of the country. It's one of the Solomon seals. This is the giant Solomon seal. So the question is, what's giant? Well, I've had these to the top of the arch, not, stretched out, but up to this point where they stretch, where they bend over. I've had them as much as 5 feet tall in the garden, depending on the year. It's a plain green foliage. It's not variegated or anything, not this form anyway, but when you pick this thing up, the flowers are ridiculous. I mean, it's just a mass of these sort of white to creamy blooms. This is polygonatum, like all of the Solomon seals, Biflorum variety commutatum. It's just the giant Solomon seal, and you can see the thing's still growing and it's producing flowers, so it's going to be blooming for quite a while. Believe it or not, this thing just popped up in my garden several years ago, out of the blue. So one that comes from this area, but you can see as you look around the side, just the amount of flowering compared to all the other Solomon seals. It's pretty fantastic. Behind it, one that I've always grown in shade gardens. It used to be a Canthopanix. It's now a Eleutherococcus, a mouthful either way. You don't really grow it for the blooms. It's in the Aurelia family. You grow it for these variegated leaves. It can take real dense shade, and it just kind of gives you a little bright spot. After the giant Solomon seal, sorry about swinging the camera there, I'll take you over to one that's a lot more common. This is one that most people will know. This is the variegated Solomon seal. Obviously shorter. This one tops out at about 2.5 feet tall. Real nice variegated foliage and that sort of reddish central stem. And I don't know if we have any blooms on this one yet. Looks like they've already finished. You can see the stalks there are bare, so those blooms have already dropped off. But if you've got a shade garden, you pretty much can't have a shade garden without the variegated Solomon seal. Great plant, looks good all summer long. Nice variegation, brights it up. And then we'll finish up with kind of an obscure one. It's hard to look at in this shot in the dark shade, but I'll take you up closer to it. Real glossy foliage. This is Dania, or Danae, depending on where you grew up. Racemosa, sometimes called poet's laurel. And it's a crazy old thing. It's actually a woody monocot, which means it's probably more closely related to corn than it is to a maple. It makes a shrub about 2.5 feet tall, evergreen. It's a little bit marginal here, but in town it's been perfectly fine. I've had this thing growing in the garden for 15 years, and it just sits there, and it's glossy green all year long. Male and female flowers on separate plants, and then the females, if you've got pollination, make a bright red fruit that looks great in the fall. So kind of an obscure one, but a nice one to pair with the variegated Solomon seal. And lots of other things coming. Hydrangeas, viburnum's already finished. That's just a little tour through part of the shade garden. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. Bye-bye.